Did you know that this is some proof of Noah's flood that nobody's talking about? Check this.
All right, let's see it.
According to the Bible, we know the survivors from Noah's Ark was Noah and his family. And careful mention is made about his 3 sons, specifically Shem. You can't see this just reading the Bible on paper, but if you graph it out, according to their age, Shem would have been able to tell Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph the story directly of the flood. Which then means that Joseph would have had first-hand evidence of the flood actually happening whilst he was enslaved in Egypt, and then when he liberated all the Israelites out of Egypt.
So there are loads of problems with this. To begin, it is not proof of anything to say a close reading of the biblical text indicates the life of Shem overlapped with the life of Joseph, therefore first-hand information could have been exchanged. That's not even a close reading of the biblical text. It's not even a close reading of the chart that this creator has up on their green screen behind them, because according to that chart, Shem died before Joseph was born. At most, Shem's life overlapped with Jacob's life, if we accept that people lived for hundreds and hundreds of years back then, which is precluded by absolutely all the available data. But not only is it not even a close reading of that chart, it's not a close reading of the biblical text, which does not allow for these folks to have been around to exchange first-hand information. Because Genesis 12 has Abraham leaving his family in Mesopotamia and settling over on the other side of ancient Southwest Asia in Canaan. And he brought with him his nephew and some wives and children and enslaved peoples. But the text does not indicate in any way, shape, or form that any great-great-great-grandparents came with them. Now, we have people occasionally making forays back to Abraham's kin to get wives to bring back to settle with them, but that kin is described as Aramaeans, and nothing in the text suggests any great-great-great-grandparents were ever brought back with them. So even within a reading of the text as a single unified narrative, this claim does not make sense. But from an academic point of view, it makes even less sense, because there's no indication any of the characters within the patriarchal narratives or the original authors of those traditions even knew who Shem was, because the primeval history is a separate set of traditions that were only brought together at later periods after their composition. And there's a lot of different literary layering going on here. Even within the story of Noah, the flood is an intrusion into a text that really only describes Noah as the inventor of viticulture, but nothing is mentioned anywhere in the patriarchal narratives that indicates any knowledge of Shem or even Noah. Their names are not mentioned anywhere else in the book of Genesis after Genesis 11, and it's not until texts like Isaiah and First Chronicles where we have any mention at all of these figures, because they were not known to the people who composed the patriarchal narratives. So at most, this creator is saying, if you squint at these timelines and ignore what the text says, we can assume that first-hand information was exchanged. And that is not proof of anything at all.
But there's even more. If there was a worldwide flood, right, and it actually happened and Shem was able to tell the story, don't you think that there would be a whole bunch of stories about a flood? And there is. To date, there's over 300 different stories about the flood in different cultures. Hawaii has a story.
So multiple problems with this as well. To begin, there are not nearly so many ancient flood myths that have had any connection whatsoever with the deluge from the book of Genesis. Even if you look at these uncritical creationist websites that try to catalog these myths, they come up with maybe 30 or 35 that have multiple points of contact with Genesis. But that is also problematic as well, because these myths only have these points of contact when we look at specific versions of them, because every single one of them comes down to us through different versions, and most of these versions are being shared with Christian missionaries who are then turning around and sharing it with the rest of the world. And when you assume that everything must derive from one single source, you're going to interpret it that way, you're going to present the data that way. So we can look at missionary accounts where they tell the story where somebody named Nu'u, which is suspiciously close to Noah, builds a bark and saves his family from a flood that covers everything, and then they land on this mountaintop and repopulate the earth. And we can find other stories where they say that wasn't the person's name at all, there was no bark, it was just a couple of people who survived on this island while everyone else was killed in a flood. And if you'd like more information about how early anthropologists and explorers interpreted the data they were being presented through a thoroughly Christian lens. I highly recommend a book by James Cox called The Invention of God in Indigenous Societies.